This is one of the most incredible conspiracies in all of American history, and it affects you and everyone you know, either directly or indirectly. The entire fate of the U.S. economy, trust in Wall Street, the future of America and its power in the world is all tied up in this decades-long conspiracy that the vast majority of Americans have never heard about. Today, we're going to talk about it on this episode of The Justin Haskins Show. My name is, of course, Justin Haskins. I'm a New York Times bestselling writer, vice president of policy at the Heartland Institute, a national nonprofit free market think tank, and a senior fellow at Our Republic, another nonprofit think tank. And I'm also the author of a brand new book called The Next Big Crash, which talks about the incredible conspiracy that I had mentioned earlier, and it's the subject of this episode of the show. Before we get into the details of this incredible story that I promise you are going to want to hear about, a quick call to action. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All of these things are going to help more people see this content, because algorithms, they pick up on video likes and subscriptions to channels and engagement with videos. And the more people who do that, the more the YouTube algorithm and other podcast algorithms will show this channel to other people. So please just take a moment. It doesn't cost any money, just a second of your time to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. All right, let's dive straight into this incredible topic of the show. I'm so excited about this. As I said earlier, brand new book out called The Next Big Crash. It's available now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. There's an audiobook version, an ebook version, paperback, hardcover. So any way that you consume books, you can get this book, The Next Big Crash. I think the best, easiest way to get it, the best price is going to be at Amazon.com. So if you're interested, go there. Audible if you want the audiobook. And by the way, I'm not making any money on this book. I know that's not usually what authors do, but in my case, all of the profits are going to nonprofit organizations that are fighting to change the laws to fix the problems that we're going to discuss today that are also obviously contained in the book. If you have any questions, you're looking for more additional insight into the topics that I'm going to lay out today, the book is the best place for it. Tons of sources of information. If you want to do more research, and I encourage you to always to do your own homework, you can find it in the book. Again, the ebook version, audiobook, paperback, hardcover. If you don't have a lot of money to spend, the ebook is, I think, only $10 on Amazon right now. So it's going to be the most affordable way to get the book. And by buying a copy of the book, and I know that right now economic times are tough for a lot of people, but buying a copy of the book is going to help solve this problem, because again, all of the profits are going to nonprofit organizations trying to fix these problems. Okay, so what is this conspiracy? What is this huge threat to the U.S. economy? Well, let me break it down to you in really simple terms. Okay, and I'm not going to go into every detail of it because it is a really complicated story, but let's break it down into simple terms. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, some of the most powerful institutions and individuals in the world gathered together to transform the way that people own property when it comes to securities investments. So we're talking, when you think of securities investments, think about stocks, bonds, Wall Street investments. When you think Wall Street, you think securities investments. If you have a retirement account or a brokerage account, you have any stocks that you own either through a retirement account or through a brokerage account, you are a owner of a security. All right. So in the 1960s and 70s, big, powerful institutions, they all got together and they transformed the relationship people have, and institutions too, to these securities investments. So that now, today, you are no longer the direct registered owner of the investments that you make. Now just stop for a second and just let that seep in. If you have a retirement account, if you've bought any stocks or bonds or anything else, you, even though you've paid for these things, are not the direct registered owner of these stocks or bonds or any of these other investments that you've made. No matter how much money you've spent, no matter how big of an institution you are not the direct registered owner of these stocks and bonds. Instead, these large institutions in the 1960s and 70s built a new institution called the Depository Trust Company, DTC. And DTC became the primary owner of all securities investments, or I should say the vast majority of securities investments in the United States today, and for many people around the world as well. Today, DTC owns more than $80 trillion worth of securities. $80 trillion worth. To put that in perspective, the annual US budget for the federal government is about $6 trillion. So we're talking about vast, vast amounts of wealth, all controlled by one singular institution. Now, DTC is a subsidiary of a corporation called DTCC. And DTCC is owned by its participant members. Who are the participant members? The participant members are large institutions that use DTCC in the financial system. So these are mostly banks and big Wall Street firms, brokerage houses. These are the places that are participant owners in DTCC, which owns DTC, which is effectively the owner, direct registered owner of all the securities investments. Now, why does this matter? Okay, let's just start there before we get into more details. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that you're not the direct registered owner of your securities investments? And what is it that you actually do own? Well, what you own is something called a securities entitlement agreement, which is basically a contract that gives you certain rights to the underlying security asset. So if you buy a stock, or you invest in an index fund through your retirement account or anything like that, or your investment manager does it for you, you don't actually buy the stock of Tesla or Nvidia or Microsoft or Apple or any of these other companies. What you buy is a contract. You buy contractual rights that are related to and provide benefits and protections for your investment related to the underlying stock. But the stock itself is actually owned by usually DTC. Okay, so you're not the direct registered owner of the stock. The direct registered owner is DTC. It was really a shell company that DTC is set up called Seed and Company, but it's controlled by DTC employees. So in effect, DTC is the owner, the direct registered owner of all of these stocks and securities. So why does it matter that you're not the direct registered owner? Because you still have contractual rights, you still get benefits, there's legal protections for you. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because if you're not the direct owner of property, not just securities investments, but any kind of property, then your rights are limited. Your rights are limited. You don't have the same rights to your securities investments and your retirement account investments as you do because of these legal changes that I'm referring to in the 1960s and 70s, as you do to, say, a car that you've paid for, or the clothes that you have in your closet, or the home that you've bought, or most property. When you think of property, you think you own it. Your ownership rights related to that property is much stronger than your rights related to these investments that you've paid for, because they're not really yours. You just have rights that are laid out in a contract, and it's heavily regulated by government and regulatory agencies, but you don't actually own it. So your rights can change. They can be changed by lawmakers. And there are laws on the books right now that actually undermine your rights to these investments. So the real reason why this story interests me, and the thing that really tipped me off to this early on, was researchers came to me and to other people that I work with, and they said, look, people don't actually own their investments. And because of this, we found, we're really concerned, because we found that laws have been changed at the state level and at the federal level, but at the state level in particular, in part of the code called the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a state law passed in all 50 states regulating commercial activity, that laws have been changed that allow big financial institutions to essentially be bailed out in the event of a catastrophic economic crash if your securities investments, the customer securities investments in stocks and bonds are used by an institution who's trying to get a loan or something like that, and they pledge it as collateral. They're not supposed to do that. But if they do that, or laws or rules are changed that allow these institutions to do that, and then the institution fails as part of a big crash, then these laws that are on the books allow the person who's the institution that's owed money to take those customers' assets and keep it for themselves as part of collateral. So let me break this down a little bit more simply for those of you who are not familiar with all these terms. I know I'm throwing a lot around, and we have a lot to cover in a very short period of time. Let's just imagine for a moment that a big financial Wall Street firm needs access to credit, okay, because they're in financial trouble. So they go to a bank and they ask for a loan. And so they pledge as collateral for access to credit, access to money to help keep them from failing, or because they want to make risky investments or do something else. They want a loan from a bank, another financial institution. So they pledge as collateral. They say, here, in case we don't pay back our loan, here, take this collateral. And as collateral, they pledge some of their customers' investments. Now, again, existing law says they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to keep their customer investments separate. But let's say they do it anyway because they're desperate. It's a financial crisis and they're desperate. What these laws in the Uniform Commercial Code say is, if that Wall Street firm fails to pay back the bank can keep the customer's assets. Now, that in alone is shocking. It's shocking. So if some big catastrophic event were to occur, and you had Wall Street firms failing all over the place, which, as I point out in the book, and I provide evidence for this, is a possibility. It may not happen this year. It may not happen next year. It may not happen in 10 years. Probably won't happen in the next 6 months. But if it happens at some point in time in the future, and who knows when it could happen at any time, then this is a very real possibility. You could have a cascading set of failures in the financial system that could swallow up, that could cause these financial institutions to pledge their customer assets as collateral out of desperation just to stay alive, to get access to loans. And if that happens, these banks could end up taking their customers' assets because the customers don't really own their securities investments. They don't really own them. So even if they do it improperly and they're not supposed to pledge it as collateral, but they do anyway, you could still lose all of your investments as a result of these laws that have been passed in the Uniform Commercial Code. One of the people who was involved in the drafting of this said that they were preparing for an Armageddon-like scenario. Armageddon. That was the word that this particular person used. That's what they're doing. Too big to fail institutions are going to be protected at the expense of regular people. Now, the problem gets even worse. Emergency powers laws are on the books right now that would make it very easy, I think, and I lay it all out in the book, to make it very easy for the federal government to declare an emergency and then say, you know what? In order to keep these big Wall Street firms from failing, because we're in the middle of a big crash, they can use their customer assets, their customer investments as collateral in loans, because after all, it's not really directly owned by the customer anyway, in order to help get them access to credit. They could change the laws using emergency powers provisions that are on the books right now in order to do that. I think there's a really good case to be made that could already happen without having to pass any new laws. And of course, new laws could be passed that firm that up and allow for institutions to do even more of that sort of thing in the future. And because you're not the direct registered owner of these securities, these investments that you bought and paid for, because you don't directly own them, there's really nothing that you can do to stop the government from allowing that to happen. Because again, it's not really yours. It belongs to DTC and DTCC. It belongs to these big centralized institutions that are housing $80+ trillion worth of wealth. You think that it belongs to you because you bought and paid for it, but it doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to Wall Street. And they've created these rules over the past several decades in order to make sure that they'll be protected in the event of a big catastrophe at your expense. That's what's been going on behind the scenes. It's an incredible story. Now, again, I lay out all the details in the book. You can find the details in the book in chapter 1 and chapter 2, especially in chapter 2 if you're interested in the details. But I want to talk for just a little bit about how the conspiracy to create this system came about. Because this is an incredible, incredible story. Incredible story. Back in the 1960s and 70s, as I said, big institutions got together and they decided that they needed to do something to transform the way that Wall Street worked because it was becoming too burdensome and expensive to do regular business on Wall Street. At the time, people were direct registered owners. If you bought stock or another security, you were the direct registered owner of that security. And you would actually get a paper certificate that would have your name on it that would say you're the registered owner of this security. And all of this paperwork was flying around Wall Street in the 1950s and 60s, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. It was starting to cause significant problems. And so these big firms got together and they decided, you know what, let's just centralize the ownership of everything. And then that way, when people buy and sell, we're just moving names around on paper because there's really just one institution that holds the vast majority of these securities investments. That would make everything so much cheaper and easier and more secure. Now, this is the official story of what would happen, of what had happened. But as you'll see, there's more to it than this. So these big institutions, they all got together and they decided to transform this system. Now, at first, when I was researching this story, I thought, okay, maybe it is just as simple as big Wall Street firms realize that if they centralize the ownership of securities assets, they could save a lot of money, they could make a lot of money, they could improve efficiency, they could solve the paperwork crisis. There was some rumors at the time that the federal government wanted to get involved in all of this, and they were trying to keep the federal government out. And so maybe it was just as simple as these big institutions realized that. Well, there's no question that big institutions made a lot of money as a result of this. The amount of trading on Wall Street, the amount of betting in something what you call derivatives contracts, which is really sort of like gambling on Wall Street. The amount of Wall Street activity dramatically increased after this new system came about because it became so much easier to make transactions on Wall Street, and because certain kinds of transactions like stock lending and other things just became a lot simpler because, of course, you only have one institution that's the owner of the vast majority of the property. So you don't need to get permission from people to do things like stock lending, to have derivatives trading, to be gambling on Wall Street. It just became a lot easier to do everything on Wall Street. And so Wall Street firms have made a fortune as a result of this transformation. And again, this has come at the expense of individuals' property rights. Maybe the story is just as simple as that. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized something more seems to have been going on. Now, this is where we're getting into a little bit of speculation. I lay all this out in the book, The Next Big Crash. Please, if you're interested, check it out. It's worth it. In chapter 3, you're going to find information about this. But what really started to concern me was the man they put in charge of this new system. So in the early 1970s, they launch DTC, decentralize the ownership of all these securities investments. And they put in charge of DTC this man named William Denser, William T. Denser. Now, William Denser is this really incredible person. I'm not trying to say that he was a horrible man or anything like that, but his story is a remarkable story. And it doesn't really add up. It makes it seem like there was something more going on here. The reason I say that is because William Denser, at the time he was put in charge of DTC, the choice to put him in that role made absolutely no sense. William Denser had no experience working in Wall Street. He had no experience as working for a big brokerage firm or anything like that, a clearinghouse. He wasn't involved in anything like DTC, even though the institutions that helped create DTC knew lots of people who did have that experience. These were industry lobbyists that were putting this together, and people who had worked in the banking industry for a long time and Wall Street for a long time. And William Denser didn't have any of that experience. It seemed like a strange choice to choose William Denser. William Denser, by the way, ended up running DTC for like 2 decades. Okay, so the first 2 decades of this whole system, it was all set up by William Denser and run by William Denser. He's really the godfather of the modern Wall Street securities ownership system. It all flows from William Denser, and William Denser didn't really make a lot of sense as the person to be put in charge of this. So what was William Denser doing at the time he was hired for this? Well, just before being hired to run DTC, he was the chief bank regulator of New York, which at the time was a really important job in banking because at the time, state regulators were the primary regulators of banks, not the federal government like they are today. And New York was the most important state regulatory job that you could possibly have because a lot of the biggest banks in America and in the world were based in New York. So William Denser was the head bank regulator of New York. Now you might say, okay, well, I don't know, that's not that crazy of a leap. You go from being the head bank regulator of New York to being the head of this DTC thing, and it's not exactly banking, but it's kind of related, and I don't know, maybe that makes sense. The problem is William Denser hadn't been in that position for very long. I think it was less than 2 years that he was in that position. If it was more than 2 years, it was just barely. And he wasn't qualified for that position either. He was appointed to that position by the governor of New York, which we'll talk about that more in a minute. So he's put in this position as the chief bank regulator, but at the time that he was given that job, he had no experience in banking. He wasn't a banker. He had no experience in banking, no experience in business, virtually no experience in the private sector. He had very little experience even working in the United States or in New York. He was not the most logical choice to be the head bank regulator, the most important bank regulatory position that you can think of at the time. It just made no sense that he would be put in that position either. So what was he doing before that? Why do I say that? Well, because before that, he was working for a New York Economic Development Commission that had been established by the governor, but he was only in that position for a very short period of time, and he wasn't qualified for that job either. He had no experience in domestic policy development. He had virtually no experience. He had virtually no experience in New York. He had no reason, there was no reason for him to be on this New York Economic Commission. So he was unqualified for that position, unqualified for the bank regulator position, and unqualified to run DTC. Strange choice. You keep going back in William Denser's history, and the story gets even weirder. So let's go all the way back to the early days of William Denser's life. William Denser is in college at a small college in Ohio, and he starts getting involved in this organization called the National Student Association. And he ends up becoming the president of the National Student Association. At the time, it was, I think, the largest student group in the United States of America. Now, while William Denser is in this National Student Organization, which was largely a progressive think Franklin Roosevelt, Democrat, nationalistic, sort of pro-American, but anti-communist, but not really conservative or limited government organization. That's where they were at this time. They were anti-communist, but they were still progressives. They were still liberals. And it was the largest student organization of its kind at the time in the 1950s when he became president of it. Now, later on, what we're going to find out, most people didn't know it at the time, but in the 1950s, while Denser was president of this National Student Association, he started receiving funding for the National Student Association from the CIA. Now, how exactly that whole arrangement came about, we don't know. Denser has one story, the CIA has another story, but the point is this. Dentzer had ties to the CIA while he was at the National Student Association. And this ended up becoming a huge scandal decades later because the CIA, when the public found out, because the CIA is not supposed to be involved in domestic life at all, really. Their mission is supposed to be with overseas actors, not with things happening in the United States. And here they were funding the National Student Association. And William Dentzer was president when this arrangement came into effect. At least that's how some of the reports frame it. So William Dentzer has this connection to the CIA while he's in the National Student Association. Fast forward several years, William Dentzer is now fighting communists as a student activist overseas, where he's still receiving support from the CIA secretly. Fast forward some years after that, William Dentzer is back in the United States and he ends up in the CIA as an officer. So now William Dentzer is working in the CIA as an officer doing top secret work. Exactly what he was doing in the CIA, we still don't entirely know, but there is this absolutely wild story that I bring up in the book that involves William Dentzer, a person who had been a friend of William Dentzer, who was also in the National Student Association previously, who ended up being what it appears to be assassinated. And William Dentzer ends up at this funeral telling the family members that he is an agent in the CIA and that this person was probably assassinated and that he was also in the CIA. And it's this really crazy, crazy story. So whatever William Dentzer was doing, he was doing top secret work for the CIA while he was in the CIA. William Dentzer leaves the CIA and ends up in the early 1960s working for JFK in this little organization, new organization at the time, that has become quite controversial under the Trump administration. I'm not going to give you the details. You're going to have to check it out in the book. But he ends up getting involved in this, what is now a controversial organization. He helps create that as part of the State Department. And then he starts doing all of these, starts getting involved in foreign affairs in South America, engaging in all of these top secret activities in South America. In places like Peru and I think Bolivia as well, and Chile it was another country, if I remember right. He's engaged in helping to prop up foreign governments. This is going on throughout the 1960s. He's engaged in propaganda efforts. He's trying to get some presidential candidates. He's trying to protect some presidents. In other cases, he's involved in efforts to undermine other presidents. All of this is going on as part under the guise of providing aid to these foreign countries, these foreign governments. So he's engaged in all of this kind of activity. And while this is going on, his last job doing this kind of work, before he ends up in New York, working for this New York Economic Commission, which then shortly leads to him taking over this institution, DTC, which ends up becoming one of the most powerful financial institutions ever created. His last job is to help prop up this government in Peru. And this government in Peru is the reason the United States cares so much about this, or one of the reasons it cares so much about this government in Peru, is they're not a communist government. And they are friendly to U.S. oil interests in Peru. In particular, there's this oil company called IPC that's operating in Peru at the time. This is all occurring in the late 1960s. And IPC is this oil company that had existed for a while. It owned these oil fields in Peru, and they were making lots of money off of the oil in Peru. And it was a big scandal in Peru at the time. Regular people felt like this was colonization and it was unfair, and that this IPC oil company was making a lot of money. And U.S. interests wanted to make sure that this oil company was still able to make money. And the owner of the oil company was, because IPC was a subsidiary of another oil company called Standard Oil. Standard Oil is owned by the Rockefeller family. The Rockefellers at the time were very powerful interests in Washington, D.C. and in finance. especially David Rockefeller, who was big into banking, and Nelson Rockefeller, who was a politician and ended up becoming vice president of the United States of America. Now, one of the primary goals here for William Denser and the other U.S. officials who were working in Peru at the time was to make sure that the existing government stayed afloat so that they could help protect this oil company, IPC. Well, right after William Denser leaves and goes to New York, I mean, literally within the same year, the country collapses from a coup. The government collapses from a coup, and the oil company ends up getting seized and nationalized. William Denser ends up in New York working on this economic commission appointed by the governor. And the governor, of course, at the time was a man named Nelson Rockefeller. So there was a Rockefeller oil company that William Denser was trying to protect in Peru. He leaves that job and goes and works for a Rockefeller in New York. And by the way, Nelson Rockefeller was an incredibly influential and powerful figure in South America generally. He was very interested in South America and all of Latin America. So is that just a coincidence? William Denser, totally unqualified to work on a domestic policy commission, ends up in New York working for a domestic policy commission after working for the CIA, working for CIA-funded organizations, working in the State Department on all these clandestine top-secret operations, propping up foreign governments and engaging in all of these, what I would call nefarious international relations. And then suddenly he ends up in New York working on domestic policy commission. And within just a very short period of time, I believe just a few years, he ends up being put in charge of the most powerful Wall Street firm in history. A coincidence? I don't think so. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is more to this story than even this. The connections that William Denser has to other powerful figures in the CIA and in government. The man that helped him get there was one of the leaders of the World Bank. There's all kinds of incredible ties. Again, if you're interested in learning more about this, check it out in The Next Big Crash in chapter 3 of the book. There's so much more that I could say in the book. I get into a whole bunch of other topics. I don't just talk about this crazy conspiracy that I've been talking about in this episode of the Justin Haskins Show. I also talk about CBDCs and some of the other currency wars and things that are going on, which will also be a huge part of The Next Big Crash. The theme of the book isn't just what's been going on with DTC. It's also, the theme of the book is really what could happen when the next big crash happens, and how can you protect yourself from all of these dangers that are out there? Not just the DTC centralization of securities ownership, but also what about CBDCs and controlling people through currency? What about all of the things that are happening overseas? What are the biggest threats to the U.S. economy right now? What could bring the U.S. economy down? If you want to understand these things and you want to protect yourself against it, you want to know what I'm doing to protect myself against it, all of this is in the book, The Next Big Crash. I wish I could talk more about it. I could talk about it all day, but I'm out of time for this episode of the show. And I hope that I've piqued your interest at least a little bit, enough to look into the book, because honestly, it is one of the most incredible stories of all time. It's one of the biggest property rights heists ever completed. Now, I don't mean heist in the sense that rights were actually stolen illegally. All of this was done legally, but it was done in a way that most people had no idea was going on. Your rights really were taken away from you. And it happened over several decades, and it involved all of these nefarious figures. And of course, there's probably a lot more to the story that we don't even know about. I mean, was the CIA behind it, or is it just a coincidence that a CIA man was chosen for it? Were the Rockefellers the primary drivers behind it, some of one of the richest families in the history of the world, or were they just sort of tangentially involved in it? Maybe they were doing all of these things to help William Denser as a favor. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, these are names that also come up in the story. What did they have to do with it? There's even ties to someone who may have been involved in the JFK assassination, believe it or not. I told you, it's a crazy story. I hope that you give it a chance. Again, the book is available now, The Next Big Crash. I encourage you to check it out. Buy a copy, lend it to a friend, buy multiple copies. If you're concerned about any of this, you want to know how to protect yourself and your family, check out The Next Big Crash, and it will provide you with all of the answers that you could need, as well as a whole bunch of research that you can use to do your own homework, to share with other people, to show them that this isn't just some crazy, wild conspiracy theory. It's not a left versus right thing. It's not a red team versus blue team thing. This whole conspiracy involves Republicans. It involves Democrats. It involves powerful Wall Street figures and big-time capitalists. It involves progressives that want to control the economy. It has all sorts of incredible things. But at the foundation, what it is it's a story about how powerful elites have put our entire economy at risk so that they could enrich themselves and so that they could make, a lot more money and protect themselves when the next financial Armageddon occurs. By the way, protecting themselves from an Armageddon, that's actually a quote. Armageddon, the use of Armageddon is a quote by one of the drafters of the people who put this law together to transform your relationship to your investments. Now, I hope you take the time to check it out. Even if you don't buy a copy, please just check it out. Leave a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel. All of these things are going to help more people see it. And if you want to be part of the solution, the best thing you can do is buy a copy of the book and share it with friends and family. All right, until next time, my name is Justin Haskins. Thank you for watching the Justin Haskins Show. Please stay free.